On a humid August morning in 1855, in Savannah, Georgia, a child stood on an auction block, and not a single person wanted to buy him. His pale skin and colorless eyes marked him as dangerous, cursed, a bearer of bad luck that no plantation owner would risk bringing onto their property. The bidding started at $20, then fell to $15, then $10. Finally, at just $5, one woman raised her fan. Paying $12 out of what she called Christian charity was Margaret Dunor, a widow who owned 4,000 acres 12 miles outside the city. Her generosity was applauded by the crowd. What they did not know was that for 3 years, Margaret had been searching for a child exactly like this one. What they could not have imagined was that over the next 14 years, 73 people would disappear on her property, their fates documented in ledgers that local authorities allegedly burned in 1861. But one ledger survived, hidden in a foundation wall, discovered during highway construction in 1959. Inside were bloodline charts, measurements, and something called the Purification Project. Before we continue with the story of that albino boy and the hidden compound where Margaret conducted her experiments, I need to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we uncover the mysteries that history tried to bury. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We want to know where our audience is hearing these dark stories. Now, let me take you back to that sweltering afternoon when a widow's terrible vision began to take shape. The summer heat in Savannah felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the crowd gathered near the waterfront slave market. Arriving in her carriage, alone as always, was Margaret Dunor, a massive woman whose size commanded attention in an era when such girth signaled wealth and power. At 47 years old, she had been a widow for 13 years, running her late husband's plantation with an iron will that made overseers nervous and neighbors wary. But what truly set Margaret apart was not her business acumen or her appearance. It was the library she had assembled over the past decade. Over 300 books on animal husbandry, anatomy, and natural philosophy, with a particular focus on breeding techniques and hereditary science. Brought to the platform that day was a boy perhaps 11 years old, so thin his ribs showed through his shirt, but it was his coloring that made the crowd fall silent. Almost translucent in the harsh sunlight appeared his skin. His hair was sparse and white blonde, and his eyes held a pinkish-gray quality that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The auctioneer, a professional named Cyrus Peaton, struggled to hide his discomfort. Lot 47, he announced without his usual enthusiasm. Male child approximately 11 years from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta. As you can see, he has a particular condition, albinism. The word was not spoken aloud, but everyone understood. In 1855 Georgia, such children carried heavy superstitious weight among both white and enslaved communities. Many believed they brought crop failures, that they could see ghosts, that they were marked by divine punishment. Common enough on plantations was the mixing of African and European ancestry, but albinism created an uncomfortable ambiguity that defied the racial categories upon which the entire system depended. When bidding opened at $20, not a single hand rose. Repeatedly, Peaton lowered it until reaching $5. Still nothing. People turned away, some making signs against evil. That was when, with deliberate slowness, Margaret raised her fan, her expression serene. The crowd turned to stare. $5 to Mrs. Dunor, Peaton said quickly, relieved to have any bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Standing, Margaret opened her purse with theatrical generosity. I will pay $12 for the poor child, she announced loudly. It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others reject. Approvingly, several women nodded. God bless you, Mrs. Dunor, called out an elderly gentleman. Acknowledging the praise with a gracious smile, she was the very picture of benevolent Christianity. But as the boy was led to her carriage, her eyes studied him with the cold calculation of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. Finally, she had found what she needed, subject zero for her purification project. Pressed into the corner of the carriage during the journey to Belmont Plantation sat the boy, whose previous owners had called him Thomas. Margaret said nothing to him, but she opened a leather journal and began writing observations: his approximate age, the specific shade of his skin and hair, the color of his eyes in different light, the size of his hands and feet. Methodically, she worked, occasionally looking up to measure him with her gaze before returning to her notes. For over 20 years, Augustus, Margaret's driver, had worked for the Dunor family. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. He had learned long ago not to question what Margaret did. Among the enslaved community in Chatham County, Belmont had a reputation. People went there and simply vanished, not escaped, because word usually spread about runaways being captured. These people ceased to exist, as if they had never been born. Toward a part of Belmont that Thomas would soon know too well rolled the carriage through Pine Forest, a collection of buildings hidden nearly a mile from the main house, accessible only by a narrow road through thick woods. These structures had been built between 1843 and 1852 using materials purchased in small quantities from different suppliers across 3 states. The workers who constructed them had been sold immediately after completion, dispersed to plantations so far apart they would never meet to compare stories. In front of the largest building, Augustus stopped the carriage, and Margaret climbed down and beckoned Thomas to follow. Unlike anything he had ever seen was the interior. Clean pine floors, whitewashed walls, glass windows. To a small room containing a bed with an actual mattress, a chair, a table with a basin, and a shelf, Margaret led him. "This will be your room," she said, a cultured voice carrying no warmth. "You will be provided with adequate food, clothing, and shelter. In return, you will cooperate with certain procedures, medical examinations, measurements, observations. Do you understand?" Understanding nothing except that survival meant obedience, Thomas nodded. "Can you read?" He shook his head. "Can you write?" Another shake. "You will be taught," Margaret said with satisfaction. "You will learn to read, write, and understand natural philosophy. These lessons begin tomorrow. You may ask questions about your lessons, but you will not ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not speak to others without permission. You will not attempt to leave. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you disobey, punishments will be severe. Do you understand?" Again, Thomas nodded, his thin body trembling. When she left, Margaret locked the door from the outside. For a long time, Thomas stood motionless before finally sitting on the edge of the mattress. He could not lie down. Instead, he sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest, waiting for whatever would come next. In the cool basement of another building, Margaret lit oil lamps and opened a journal. She dipped her pen in ink and began writing in neat, precise script. August 17, 1855. Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Initial observations suggest excellent quality for the purification project. Pure albinism evident in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary measurements tomorrow, followed by educational assessment. Subject 0 represents the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build. If theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. For another hour, she continued writing, documenting every detail she had observed about Thomas. To Margaret, he was not a person. He was the key to unlocking what she believed were the secrets of human heredity, and she would spend the next 4 years preparing him for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would haunt Chatham County for generations. A rigid schedule that Margaret enforced with absolute consistency defined Thomas's days at Belmont. Each morning at 6 o'clock, he woke when Margaret herself unlocked his door, a routine she maintained to establish her complete authority. With measuring tape and notebook, she would enter, recording his height against marks on the door frame. Once per week, she weighed him on a scale imported from Philadelphia. Once per month, she performed a complete physical examination that lasted over an hour, measuring every aspect of his development with clinical precision. After morning measurements, Thomas received breakfast, cornmeal mush, occasionally supplemented with milk or molasses. Precise caloric intake necessary for optimal growth had been calculated by Margaret. At 7 o'clock, his education began. A tutor hired by Margaret, a nervous young man from Savannah named Christopher Vance, came twice weekly to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Vance believed he was participating in progressive research testing whether enslaved children could learn academic subjects. He had no idea about Margaret's broader project. An exceptional student, Thomas proved, absorbing information with impressive speed. By the end of his first year, he could read complex texts, write in clear handwriting, and perform advanced mathematics. Pleased, Margaret seemed, though her satisfaction manifested as clinical approval rather than warmth. From her library, she assigned him books, anatomical texts with detailed illustrations, agricultural manuals about livestock breeding, natural philosophy books discussing heredity and variation. But during Margaret's private lessons, the true purpose of his education became clear. She would sit across from Thomas in one of the compound school rooms, anatomy charts hanging between them, and explain her theories. She showed him how characteristics passed from parents to children, displayed charts documenting horse breeding, and explained how desirable traits could be concentrated through careful selection. Then, her voice never changing tone, she would transition to human heredity. She explained her belief that races represented different developmental stages, that characteristics like intelligence and beauty were inherited and could be improved through selective breeding. With his face impassive, his pale eyes fixed on the charts, Thomas listened. He had learned that interrupting brought sharp rebukes. Margaret never struck him. She did not need to. The isolation and total control she exercised were punishment enough. He was allowed contact with no one except Margaret, Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who brought supplies, but never spoke beyond necessary words. What Thomas did not yet understand was that Margaret was preparing him for a specific role. She was educating him not from progressive ideals, but because she needed him to comprehend what would eventually be required. She needed him to understand heredity, to grasp why certain pairings produce certain results, to appreciate the significance of her experiment. Because eventually, when he matured, he would become not just a subject of observation, but an active participant in creating what Margaret called her improved line. Beyond Thomas, the compound held others, though he rarely saw them. Through his window, he sometimes glimpsed people moving between buildings under escort. He heard voices, occasionally muffled through walls. At night, sometimes there were sounds that disturbed him, crying, screaming, or long silences that felt worse. He learned never to ask about these things. Approximately 25 people at any time were maintained by Margaret in the compound, though specific individuals changed frequently. She acquired them through various means, purchasing those with particular characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to dispose of, occasionally bringing in people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wanted to study. In communal rooms, these people lived, sleeping on pallets, given adequate food and shelter, but kept in complete isolation from the outside world. On each person, Margaret maintained detailed records, measurements, health status, family history if known, and specific characteristics she deemed desirable or undesirable. With cold calculation, she arranged pairings, keeping charts that tracked which combinations produced children with which traits. Dozens of births over 13 years she had documented. But something darker was also shown by the records, a high mortality rate, especially among infants, and numerous disappearances. Perhaps the darkest aspect was the truth about these disappearances. When children were born with what Margaret called degenerate characteristics, severe deformities or health problems, they did not survive long. Her records noted they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness. But different stories were told by witnesses who came forward after Margaret's death. They described infants taken away shortly after birth and never seen again. They described a small cemetery deep in the pine forest marked only by numbered wooden stakes. They described the copper-lined basement where Margaret preserved biological specimens in alcohol jars, including some that appeared disturbingly human. None of this was known to Thomas during his early years. His world consisted of his room, the school room, the examination room, and occasionally the yard where Margaret allowed him supervised exercise. Carefully, she maintained his health, ensuring adequate nutrition, fresh air, and physical activity. But it was livestock management, not compassion. As Thomas approached his 14th birthday in 1857, new dimensions were taken on by Margaret's lessons. She began explaining reproductive biology in explicit detail using anatomical charts and preserved specimens. With clinical precision, she discussed conception, gestation, and birth. With growing emphasis on his unique characteristics, she explained genetic inheritance. "You represent something remarkable," she told him during one lesson, her eye studying him with calculating intensity. "Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive characteristics. If paired correctly with subjects possessing complementary traits, the offspring would be invaluable for understanding hereditary mechanisms. You are not simply a subject to be observed, Thomas. You are the key to the next phase of this research." Intelligent enough to understand what she suggested was Thomas, and the knowledge filled him with profound dread. But he had nowhere to run. The compound was surrounded by miles of forest patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he escaped, where would an albino teenage boy go in 1857 Georgia? He would be captured immediately, returned, punished severely. Her furniture, Margaret owned him as completely as she owned, and the law supported her absolute right to do anything she wanted. But during his recovery from a serious bout of pneumonia in spring 1858, something unexpected occurred. Augustus, the driver, began speaking to him during supply deliveries. Brief conversations, never more than a few sentences, always when Margaret was absent. Augustus would ask how Thomas felt, comment on weather, mention small details about life outside the compound. Profoundly affected Thomas were these tiny human connections after years of isolation and clinical treatment. One afternoon in June 1858, as Thomas sat in the yard regaining his strength, Augustus brought supplies and lingered. "You know she won't stop," he said quietly. "Whatever she's planning, she won't stop. But you're smarter than most. You've been learning from her books. Maybe you can figure something she can't." Before Thomas could respond, Augustus moved away. But the words planted something in Thomas's mind. For 3 years, he had been passive, accepting his fate because he saw no alternative. But Augustus was right. He could read. He had access to Margaret's library. He understood more about her theories than she realized. And if he was careful, patient, and clever, perhaps he could find a way to use that knowledge. As summer arrived and Thomas's health returned, with renewed intensity Margaret resumed her lessons. She informed him that the following year, when he turned 15, he would begin the next phase. She had identified several women in the compound with what she called optimal characteristics, and Thomas would be paired with them to produce children that could be studied from birth. With clinical detachment, she explained this, as if discussing crop rotation rather than the systematic exploitation of a teenage boy. Thomas listened, nodded, and said nothing. But behind his pale eyes, something had changed. He was no longer just a passive subject. He was planning. And as he lay in his room each night, he began to understand that knowledge could be a weapon. As part of her experiment, Margaret had educated him, never considering that education might give him tools to resist. It was a mistake that would eventually unravel everything she had built. An unexpected complication was brought by the autumn of 1858. On October 12, Dr. Harrison Pembroke arrived at Belmont unannounced and carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society of Charleston. Pembroke, a rising figure in Southern medical circles, had developed a fascination with hereditary pathologies. He had heard rumors of Margaret's private research facility and traveled from South Carolina specifically to meet her. In the main house, Margaret received him, serving tea while assessing this unexpected visitor. Pembroke was 42, tall and thin, with angular features and hands that moved constantly as he spoke. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Charleston to establish a practice. But his true passion was research. His published papers on hereditary illness, his theories about racial characteristics, his belief that scientific breeding could improve human stock, he showed these to Margaret. The future of medicine lies not in treating illness after it appears, Pembroke explained enthusiastically, but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. Imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eliminated through careful selection, where each generation is stronger than the last. This is achievable through systematic breeding principles. Rapidly, Margaret listened, calculating. Both opportunity and threat were represented by Pembroke. An opportunity because his medical expertise exceeded hers and he might advance her research. A threat because he might discover the full scope of her experiments and react with moral objection. Many physicians espoused eugenic theories abstractly, but might balk at practical applications. "Your ideas are fascinating, Dr. Pembroke," she said carefully. "Some observations of heredity among the enslaved population here I have maintained. Nothing as systematic as your research, perhaps, but enough to convince me that animal husbandry principles do apply to human beings." Leaning forward, Pembroke, eyes bright, said, "I would be honored to see your work. Perhaps I might contribute observations that could advance both our studies." After a long pause, Margaret made her decision. "Very well, Doctor. I will show you my facility, but I must insist on complete discretion. The work is scientifically sound, but the general public lacks education to understand its importance." "You have my word as a gentleman and man of science," Pembroke replied solemnly. The following morning, Margaret led Pembroke to the compound. As they walked through pine forest, she explained her theories and methods in greater detail than she had ever shared. She described 13 years of controlled breeding, meticulous documentation, attempts to isolate and predict hereditary traits. With rapt attention, Pembroke listened, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated his medical knowledge and genuine interest. When they reached the compound, first Margaret took him to the building containing her records. Shelf after shelf of journals, charts, and diagrams documenting births, deaths, measurements, and observations spanning over a decade. With growing excitement, Pembroke examined these. "Extraordinary," he murmured, examining a journal from 1847 documenting 3 generations of a family line. "Across years, you have maintained consistency. The level of detail is remarkable." He paused, reading more carefully. "Though I must say the infant mortality rate appears quite high, 37% in this cohort alone." This, Margaret had anticipated. "Weak specimens," she replied smoothly, "those with obvious deformities or constitutional weaknesses suggesting degenerate heredity. Detailed autopsy records on each case I have maintained. The losses, while regrettable, provide valuable data about which characteristics breed true and which represent hereditary failure." Slowly, Pembroke nodded, though discomfort flickered across his face, but scientific curiosity overrode moral qualms. "And you have preserved specimens?" They descended into the copper-lined basement where Margaret maintained her collection. Rows of glass jars lined wooden shelves, each containing biological specimens suspended in clear fluid. With professional interest, Pembroke examined them, making notes. Most were organs or tissue samples, but several jars contained small, fully formed bodies. Infants no more than a few days old, their tiny faces frozen in expression suggesting they had not died peacefully. "You conducted autopsies yourself?" Pembroke asked. "I had assistance from a physician in Savannah initially until he passed in 1851. Since then, I have performed examinations independently. My anatomical knowledge is largely self-taught, but adequate for the purpose." More than adequate, Pembroke straightened, closing his notebook. "Mrs. Dunor, what you have accomplished here represents a singular achievement. The scope, duration, and attention to detail are remarkable. You should publish these findings." Margaret shook her head. "Publication is impossible. The public would never understand. I am content to continue research privately, advancing knowledge for its own sake." "Then perhaps we might collaborate," Pembroke suggested. "I could analyze your data, contribute medical expertise, help design additional studies. With proper methodology, we could produce findings that would revolutionize understanding of human heredity." Carefully, Margaret considered. Collaboration meant shared control and increased risk of exposure. But the possibility of achieving true scientific breakthrough was alluring. "Let me show you the crown jewel of the project," she said finally. She led him to Thomas's room. The boy sat at his table, reading from a medical text. He looked up as the door opened, pale eyes moving from Margaret to the stranger. At 15, Thomas had grown considerably, though he remained thin. His white blonde hair was cut short, and his pallid skin seemed almost luminous in the afternoon light. "This is Subject 0, Margaret announced with unmistakable pride. "A pure albino acquired 4 years ago specifically for this project. I have documented every aspect of his development, provided extensive education in anatomy and natural philosophy, and maintained his health carefully in preparation for the breeding phase." With undisguised fascination, Pembroke stared. He approached slowly and spent the next 30 minutes conducting a thorough examination while Thomas sat motionless, enduring the stranger's probing hands with passive acceptance learned over years in the compound. Pembroke measured, palpated, looked into Thomas's eyes with various instruments. He asked questions about health history, vision, and sensitivity to sunlight. In a quiet, educated voice that clearly surprised Pembroke, Thomas answered. "You have taught him to speak properly," Pembroke observed. "And to read, interesting choice." "Education serves multiple purposes," Margaret explained. "It allows him to understand the research significance, ensuring cooperation. It provides data on intellectual capacity of albino subjects. And practically, as he matures, he will need to understand breeding protocols sufficiently to participate effectively." Straightening, Pembroke said, "Participate in breeding protocols. You intend to use him as a stud essentially when he reaches appropriate maturity." "Yes. He is now 15. I plan to begin the breeding phase within 6 months, pairing him with carefully selected women to produce offspring that can be studied from conception through development. Poorly understood is the hereditary transmission of albinism. By controlling parentage and documenting results across multiple pairings, we can determine whether it breeds true and what other characteristics are linked to it." For the first time, Pembroke looked genuinely uncomfortable. His eyes moved from Margaret to Thomas and back. "He is still quite young." "Enslaved boys his age father children regularly throughout the South," Margaret replied coolly. "There is nothing unusual in this. And unlike field workers forced into casual unions, Subject 0 will participate in controlled documented breeding for scientific purposes. The context is entirely different." For a long moment, Pembroke said nothing. Scientific enthusiasm warring with residual moral sense, but Margaret had calculated correctly that intellectual ambition would win. "What assurances do I have that offspring will be properly documented?" he finally asked. "Without complete records from conception through maturity, the data loses much value." "For 13 years, I have maintained such records," Margaret said. "I have no intention of relaxing standards now. Every conception will be documented, every pregnancy monitored, every birth recorded in detail. Children will be raised here where development can be observed systematically. You will have complete access to all records. Then I accept your offer of collaboration." Pembroke said. "I can visit monthly to conduct examinations and contribute medical expertise. In exchange, I ask only that I receive credit when these findings are eventually published." On the arrangement, they shook hands. In silence, Thomas watched this exchange, understanding with perfect clarity that his fate had just been sealed. The one hope he had harbored, that Margaret might postpone or abandon her plans, evaporated. She had found validation from a respected physician, who not only accepted her work, but wanted to participate. There would be no reprieve. That evening, after Pembroke departed, Margaret visited Thomas's room. "Dr. Pembroke is impressed with our work," she said. "He believes we are on the verge of significant scientific breakthrough. You should feel privileged to participate in research of such importance." Thomas remained silent. "I expect your cooperation," Margaret continued, voice hardening. "You have been given advantages no enslaved person could dream of. Education, adequate food and shelter, protection from fieldwork brutalities. Considerable resources in your development I have invested. The time has come for you to fulfill the purpose for which you were acquired." Still, Thomas said nothing. Briefly, Margaret studied him, then left, locking the door behind her. In darkness, Thomas finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of despair. He was 15 years old, utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare that presented itself as science. And now, a respected physician had validated everything Margaret believed, ensuring the horror would continue and escalate. But for 4 years, Thomas had spent reading Margaret's books, studying her theories, understanding how she thought, and he had begun noticing something neither Margaret nor Pembroke seemed to recognize. Their grand theories about heredity, their predictions about which traits would appear in offspring were wrong more often than right. Disappointing results were shown by Margaret's charts, children who did not match predictions, characteristics that appeared or disappeared without explanation. To insufficient data or hidden hereditary factors, Margaret attributed failures. But Thomas, reading the same books, understanding the same theories, had begun suspecting something more fundamental, that heredity was far more complex than anyone yet understood, and that Margaret's confidence in controlling and predicting it was a delusion. Something he had not had before was given to him by this insight: hope. Not hope for escape, which seemed impossible, but hope that on its own terms, Margaret's experiment might fail, that results might prove so inconsistent that even she would be forced to acknowledge limitations. It was thin hope, dependent on outcomes years in the future. But it was something. And as Thomas lay in his narrow bed that October night, he made a silent vow. He would cooperate with Margaret's demands because he had no choice. But he would watch, learn, and remember, and if he survived long enough, if Margaret's experiment eventually unraveled, as he suspected it would, he would make certain the world knew what happened in this hidden place. On November 18, 1858, Harrison Pembroke returned to Belmont, carrying medical instruments, journals, and supplies he deemed necessary for what he called proper scientific documentation of the breeding phase. Warmly, Margaret received him, relieved to have found not just a collaborator, but someone who shared her vision completely. For Pembroke's visit, Thomas had been prepared. In clinical detail, Margaret had explained what would be expected using anatomical charts and breeding manuals to illustrate procedures. 3 women from the compound's population she had selected, all in their late teens or early 20s, all exhibiting what she called optimal physical characteristics. Their documentation, she showed Thomas, detailed measurements, family histories, health assessments. She explained he would be paired with each woman in succession, that conceptions and pregnancies would be monitored closely, that resulting children would remain in the compound for systematic study. With his face carefully blank, Thomas listened, revealing nothing of the revulsion and terror inside. He understood resistance was impossible. Absolute power over everyone in the compound was held by Margaret, and medical authority to her commands was added by Pembroke's participation. Eliza was the name of the first woman Margaret selected. She was 19, tall and slender, with features Margaret's records described as refined type, suggesting mixed heredity favorable for observing albinism transmission. For 2 years, Eliza had been at the compound, taken from Belmont's main plantation after giving birth to a child Margaret wanted to study. That child, a daughter, had been removed shortly after birth. Again, Eliza never saw her. Withdrawn and deeply traumatized, the experience left her, though Margaret's notes characterized her simply as compliant subject with minimal resistance. On a cold November afternoon, Margaret brought Eliza to Thomas's room. Outside, Pembroke waited, ready to enter after what Margaret estimated would be sufficient time. To both, she explained what was expected, her voice carrying no more emotion than if instructing servants on housekeeping. Then she left them alone, locking the door from outside. For a long time, neither moved nor spoke. On opposite sides of the small room, they stood, 2 terrified young people trapped in a nightmare. Neither had power to escape. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. "I know you," she said softly. "I seen you from the window sometimes. The white boy she keeps locked up. Been here long as me, maybe longer." Thomas nodded. "For years." "What'd she make you do?" "Study, read her books, learn about." He gestured helplessly at anatomical charts on the wall. "This." To the window, Eliza moved. "My baby was a girl. Pretty little thing. Mrs. Dunor took her away that same night. Told me the baby died, but I heard her crying for days after in some other part of the building. Then I didn't hear nothing no more. Flat was her voice, drained of emotion by grief too large to fully express. You think that baby really died? Thomas did not answer because he did not know what truth would be kinder. Instead, he said, I'm sorry. To look at him, Eliza turned, her eyes holding depths of sorrow. You and me, we got no choices here. She own us. She can make us do whatever she want. So I guess we do what she say and maybe we survive. That's all there is. What happened next in that locked room will not be described in detail because some horrors need not be rendered explicit to be understood. It is enough to say that two young people stripped of all agency tried to retain some shred of dignity in an utterly degrading situation. When Margaret unlocked the door an hour later, followed by Pembroke carrying medical instruments, both Thomas and Eliza had been changed in ways that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. An examination of Eliza that was invasive and humiliating was conducted by Pembroke, documenting everything in his notebook with clinical precision. As if Eliza were not present, he discussed findings with Margaret, using medical terminology that dehumanized her completely. Then he dismissed her, and she was escorted back to her sleeping quarters. Thomas remained, and similar examination and questioning was subjected to him by Pembroke, recording observations about his physical response, emotional state, and comprehension of what had occurred. On November 25, Margaret and Pembroke repeated this process with the second woman, Sarah. Sarah was 18, at the compound only 6 months, purchased from a plantation near Augusta because Margaret's records indicated desirable hereditary traits. Unlike Eliza, whose trauma produced resignation, Sarah's manifested as rage. When Margaret explained what would be required, Sarah refused outright, voice shaking with fury and fear. You can beat me, sell me, kill me, Sarah said, but I ain't doing this. This ain't right, and you know it. Unmoved, Margaret remained. You have no right to refuse. You are property purchased specifically for this purpose. Your cooperation is required. Then you're going to have to force me. To the overseer, Margaret nodded. Take her to the isolation room. No food until she reconsiders. In a small windowless basement room, Sarah was locked, receiving only water and a single small piece of bread daily. For 6 days, she remained there. On the second day, Margaret visited to ask if she had reconsidered. Weakened but defiant, Sarah refused. On the 4th day, with Pembroke, Margaret visited, who explained in medical terms the damage prolonged starvation would cause, emphasizing permanent harm she was inflicting on herself through pointless resistance. Sarah wept, but did not relent. On the 6th day, a different approach was taken by Margaret. She brought Eliza to the isolation room and made her describe what had happened, emphasizing that Eliza had survived, had not been physically harmed, that continued resistance would only prolong Sarah's suffering without changing the outcome. Exhausted and broken, Eliza delivered this message as instructed, though her voice carried an apology Margaret had not scripted. Finally, Sarah surrendered. She was too weak to walk, so the overseer carried her to Thomas's room where the process was repeated. With clinical detachment, Pembroke documented everything, noting that subject's physical condition compromised by resistance period, recommend improved nutritional preparation for future pairings. The third woman, Hannah, witnessed what happened to Sarah and offered no resistance when her turn came in early December. She was 21, at the compound for 3 years, and had learned long ago that survival meant absolute submission. She complied with everything Margaret demanded, her face an expressionless mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Afterward, with satisfaction, Pembroke noted that subject demonstrated optimal compliance, suggesting effective conditioning protocols. In a state of numb dissociation, Thomas endured these weeks. Each night, locked in his room, he stared at the ceiling and tried to separate his mind from his body to preserve some core of self that remained untouched by what Margaret forced him to do. Obsessively, he read, losing himself in anatomical diagrams and breeding charts, anything to avoid thinking. And carefully, he watched Margaret's records whenever he had access, noting growing discrepancies between her predictions and actual results from previous experiments. Meanwhile, Margaret was triumphant. She had successfully initiated the breeding phase with Subject 0, documenting every detail with Pembroke's assistance. She calculated conception probabilities, estimated gestation periods, planned observation protocols for the pregnancies she anticipated. In her journal, she wrote extensive entries predicting that offspring would provide unprecedented insights into albinism inheritance. But nature had its own plans. Of the 3 women, only Eliza conceived. Sarah and Hannah's bodies, stressed by trauma and harsh conditions, did not support conception despite repeated pairings in subsequent months. To constitutional weakness, Margaret attributed this, noting it as data supporting her theories. She did not consider or chose not to acknowledge that profound trauma might affect fertility. With obsessive attention, Eliza's pregnancy was monitored. Weekly, Margaret and Pembroke examined her, measuring her abdomen, listening to the fetal heartbeat, documenting every aspect of gestation. They discussed predictions. Would the child show albinism? What would the skin color be? The eye color? With scientific enthusiasm, they debated these questions, apparently blind to Eliza's growing despair as her pregnancy advanced. Occasionally from his window or during brief periods when compound residents were allowed in the yard, Thomas saw Eliza. Through winter into spring, her belly grew. Slowly, heavily, she moved, her face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. Once their eyes met across the yard, and Thomas saw grief so profound it stopped his breath. She was mourning her child before it was even born, knowing what fate awaited any baby born in this place. As Eliza's due date approached in May 1859, with additional supplies, Margaret prepared the compound's medical room. Numerous babies in the compound over the years she had delivered, and with particular anticipation she approached this birth. To be present, Pembroke arranged, bringing specialized instruments and promising to conduct immediate examination of the newborn to document initial characteristics. On May 17, 1859, the birth happened. After 18 hours of labor, throughout, Margaret and Pembroke attended, treating Eliza's suffering as an inconvenient but necessary aspect of data collection. When the baby finally emerged, a girl weighing just over 6 pounds, Margaret's first action was not to comfort the exhausted mother, but to examine the infant's skin and eyes under bright lamplight. The baby was not albino. Her skin was light brown, her eyes dark, her hair black. She appeared entirely healthy, crying vigorously when Pembroke conducted his examination. Visible disappointment was Margaret's initial reaction. After 4 years of preparation, selecting, and educating Subject 0, carefully orchestrating this breeding experiment, the primary characteristic she had hoped to study had not appeared in the first offspring. Recessive trait, Pembroke observed, making notes. As expected, requires both parents to carry the characteristic. The mother obviously does not carry albinism genes, therefore offspring shows normal pigmentation. We would need multiple generations and careful selection to isolate the recessive expression. Nodding, Margaret, her mind already calculating next steps, said, Subject 0 will need to be paired with his own female offspring. Once they reach maturity, that is the only way to increase probability of albino expression in subsequent generations. This child will be designated Generation 1, Female 1. When she reaches approximately 15 years of age, she will be bred back to Subject 0. On the birthing bed, Eliza, lying exhausted, overheard this conversation. Clear enough were the implications, even through her pain and fatigue. They intended to take her daughter, raise her in this compound, and eventually force her into the same nightmare Eliza had endured. The realization produced a sound from Eliza that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something more primal, a sound of absolute despair that would haunt Thomas, who heard it from his locked room for the rest of his life. For 1 week, Margaret allowed Eliza to nurse the baby, long enough to establish feeding. Then on May 24, the infant was removed and taken to a separate room where a wet nurse, another enslaved woman, would provide care under Margaret's supervision. To the general population of the compound, Eliza was returned, her body still recovering from birth, her arms empty, her milk drying painfully because she had no baby to feed. After that week in May, a strange, tense quiet fell over the compound. Almost entirely ceased the sounds from other buildings. Subdued seemed even Margaret, though she maintained her routines and continued documenting observations with mechanical precision. Something had shifted. Some balance had broken, though Thomas could not identify exactly what. What no one knew was that during that week when she was allowed to hold her daughter, a decision had been made by Eliza. A decision born from love so fierce it manifested as terrible action. On the 6th night, when darkness was complete and the compound was quiet, Eliza did something that ensured her daughter would never be used in Margaret Dunour's experiment. The next morning, both of them were found by the wet nurse. Eliza's arms wrapped around the tiny body that had ceased breathing sometime in the night. Never recorded were the details, never documented the method. In her records, Margaret simply noted,